Have you ever felt spiritually tired, but you couldn't explain why? Nothing dramatic happened. There was no crisis. No major tragedy. From the outside, life looked normal. You went to work. You talked with friends. You did your daily routine. But somewhere deep inside, something felt different. Your motivation faded. The passion you once had for prayer felt weaker. The excitement you once felt when thinking about God slowly became quieter. And sometimes you wondered, what happened to my faith? Why do I feel distant from God, even though nothing terrible happened? Many Christians experience this season at some point in their lives. It doesn't feel like a spiritual battle. There are no obvious signs of attack. There is no chaos, no visible conflict, no dramatic moment that makes you realize something is wrong. Instead, it feels subtle, quiet, almost invisible. And that is exactly why it is so dangerous. Because the most effective spiritual attacks are rarely the loud ones. They are the quiet ones. Most believers imagine spiritual warfare as something obvious. They picture dramatic moments of temptation, clear moments of moral struggle, or situations where evil feels unmistakably present. But in reality, some of the most powerful spiritual attacks do not look like battles at all. They look like ordinary life. They appear in small moments. Tiny shifts in attention, gradual changes in priorities. They happen so slowly that many people never recognize what is actually happening. And before they realize it, their spiritual life begins to drift. Prayer becomes less frequent. Reading scripture feels less urgent. Time with God slowly gets replaced with other things. Not necessarily bad things, just other things. More responsibilities, more distractions, more noise. And eventually, a person who once felt deeply connected to God begins to feel strangely distant. Not because they stopped believing, not because they rejected their faith, but because something slowly pulled their attention away. The enemy rarely needs to destroy someone's faith in a single moment. That would be too obvious. Instead, he often works through something far more subtle. Distraction. Because if someone becomes distracted long enough, their spiritual strength begins to fade without them even noticing. Imagine a candle burning in a dark room. At first, the flame burns bright. It fills the room with light. But if the oxygen in the room slowly decreases, something begins to happen. The flame becomes smaller, weaker, dimmer, until eventually it disappears. Not because someone blew it out, but because the environment slowly changed. The same thing can happen in a person's spiritual life. The passion that once burned brightly begins to fade. Not suddenly, but gradually. And many believers assume that this is simply part of life. They believe they are just tired, busy, overwhelmed. But what if something deeper is happening? What if the quiet spiritual exhaustion so many believers experience is actually part of a spiritual attack that most people never recognize? An attack that does not come through chaos, but through quiet drift. Because the enemy understands something about human nature. If he can distract your attention long enough, he can weaken your connection with God. If he can fill your life with constant noise, you will slowly lose the ability to hear the quiet voice of God. If he can keep you busy with things that seem important, you may never notice that the most important relationship in your life is slowly growing distant. And the tragedy is that many believers do not realize this until much later. They look back and wonder how their faith became weaker. They wonder why prayer feels difficult. They wonder why their relationship with God feels less alive than it once did. But the answer is often not a single moment of failure. It is a long season of unnoticed drift. The spiritual attack most Christians don't recognize is not always temptation. It is not always suffering. Sometimes it is simply distraction, a slow shift of focus away from God. And the longer that shift continues, the more powerful it becomes. But here is the good news. Once you recognize this kind of spiritual attack, its power begins to weaken. Because awareness changes everything. When you begin to see how distraction works, when you begin to recognize the subtle ways your faith can drift, you can begin to take back control of your spiritual life. You can begin to rebuild the connection that once felt strong. And you can begin to protect the most important relationship you have. Because the truth is, the greatest battle in many believers' lives is not the battle they see. It is the battle they don't notice. And understanding that battle may be the first step toward rediscovering a deeper, stronger faith than you ever had before. When most people hear the phrase spiritual attack, they imagine something dramatic. They picture intense moments of temptation. They imagine sudden crises that shake their faith, or situations where darkness feels obvious and overwhelming. But one of the greatest misunderstandings about spiritual warfare is the assumption that it always looks dramatic. In reality, the most effective spiritual attacks are often the quietest ones. They do not announce themselves. They do not create immediate chaos. Instead, they blend into the normal rhythm of everyday life. And because they appear so ordinary, they often go completely unnoticed. This is why many believers never recognize when this kind of spiritual battle begins. At first, nothing seems wrong. Life simply becomes busier. There are more responsibilities, more tasks, more demands on your time and attention. Your schedule becomes full. Your mind becomes crowded with things to do. And slowly, without realizing it, something important begins to shift. The time you once spent in prayer becomes shorter. The moments you once used to reflect on your faith begin to disappear. Reading scripture becomes something you intend to do later, but later never seems to come. At first, it doesn't feel like a spiritual issue. It feels like life. Just normal life. You tell yourself you're just busy. You'll reconnect with God when things calm down. But the truth is, life rarely becomes less busy on its own. Responsibilities rarely disappear. Distractions rarely slow down. And if nothing changes, that temporary distance slowly becomes a new normal. This is one of the enemy's most subtle strategies. Not destruction, disconnection. Because if he can gradually weaken a person's connection with God, everything else becomes easier. Faith becomes weaker. Discernment becomes duller. Spiritual strength begins to fade. And the person often does not realize what is happening until much later. Think about how relationships work in everyday life. Strong relationships require attention. They require time. They require intentional connection. If two close friends stop talking regularly, their relationship does not collapse overnight. There is no sudden explosion, no dramatic moment of separation. Instead, something much quieter happens. Days pass, then weeks, then months. Conversations become shorter. Contact becomes less frequent. And eventually the closeness that once felt natural begins to fade. Not because either person intentionally ended the relationship, but because connection slowly disappeared. The same thing can happen in a person's spiritual life. The relationship with God does not suddenly vanish. But without intentional connection, the closeness begins to weaken. And this is where spiritual distraction becomes powerful. Distraction is not always something obviously harmful. Sometimes it comes through good things. Work, family responsibilities, personal goals, daily obligations. None of these things are wrong on their own. But when they begin to consume all of our attention, something important gets pushed aside. The quiet moments where faith grows. The moments of reflection. The moments of prayer. The moments where someone slows down long enough to listen for God's voice. In a world filled with constant noise, silence becomes rare. And silence is often where spiritual clarity begins. But when life becomes filled with endless activity, the space for spiritual awareness begins to shrink. Many believers live in this environment every day without realizing its impact. They wake up and immediately check their phones. Their minds fill with news, messages, notifications, and responsibilities. The day becomes a constant flow of information and activity. By the time the evening arrives, their energy is gone, and the thought of slowing down for prayer or reflection feels difficult. So they promise themselves they will reconnect tomorrow. But tomorrow often looks the same. This cycle can continue for weeks, months, even years. And during that time, something slowly changes inside a person's heart. Faith that once felt vibrant becomes quiet. The excitement of spiritual discovery becomes routine. The sense of closeness with God becomes distant. And the most dangerous part is that many believers assume this is normal. They believe this is simply what happens when life becomes busy. But spiritual drift is not inevitable. It is often the result of attention being pulled away little by little. The enemy understands that human attention is limited. Where attention goes, energy follows. Where energy follows, influence grows. So if he can redirect attention away from God, he can slowly weaken the foundation of someone's spiritual life. And he rarely does this through obvious evil. He does it through endless distraction. Because distraction rarely feels dangerous. It feels harmless. Scrolling through information, watching videos, constantly checking updates, running from one responsibility to another. None of these things feel like spiritual threats. But when they consume most of a person's time and attention, they quietly reshape priorities. And eventually, the most important relationship in a believer's life begins to receive the least attention. This is why the spiritual attack most Christians don't recognize is so effective. It doesn't look like a battle. It looks like normal life. A full schedule. A busy mind. A constant stream of activity that leaves little room for stillness. And without stillness, it becomes harder to hear the quiet voice of God. Harder to reflect on spiritual truth. Harder to notice when faith begins to drift. But the moment someone becomes aware of this pattern, something powerful can begin to change. Because once you recognize distraction as a spiritual threat, you begin to see your life differently. You begin to notice where your attention is going. You begin to ask deeper questions about what truly deserves your time. You begin to understand that protecting your spiritual focus is not just a personal choice. It is part of spiritual warfare. Because faith grows where attention is protected. And the more intentional someone becomes about guarding their attention, the stronger their connection with God can become again. The attack may be quiet, but awareness is powerful. And sometimes the simple act of recognizing what is happening is the first step toward reclaiming the spiritual strength that once felt distant. One of the most dangerous things about spiritual drift is how quietly it begins. No one wakes up one morning and decides they want to grow distant from God. No one intentionally plans to weaken their faith. In fact, most believers genuinely want to stay close to God. They want their faith to remain strong. They want their spiritual life to feel alive and meaningful. But drift does not begin with a decision. It begins with small shifts. Tiny changes that seem harmless at first. Moments that feel insignificant in the moment, but slowly accumulate over time. Imagine a boat resting near the shore of a calm lake. If the boat is not anchored, it may stay near the shore for a while. At first, it barely moves. The water is calm. The distance from the shore looks almost the same. But slowly, quietly, the current begins to move the boat. Not in a dramatic way. Not fast enough for anyone to immediately notice. Just a few inches at a time. Then a few feet. Then a little farther. And if no one is paying attention, something surprising eventually happens. The boat that once sat close to the shore suddenly finds itself far away. And the people inside might look around in confusion. How did we get this far from where we started? The answer is simple. Drift. The same process can happen in a person's spiritual life. It does not begin with rebellion. It begins with distraction. The first sign of spiritual drift is often a quiet shift in priorities. The things that once felt essential slowly become optional. Prayer becomes something you plan to do later. Reading scripture becomes something you hope to return to when you have more time. Worship becomes something that feels routine instead of personal. At first, these changes seem small. Missing a prayer one day does not feel serious. Skipping a moment of reflection does not feel like a spiritual crisis. But when these moments begin to repeat over and over again, the pattern begins to reshape your spiritual life. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. And slowly, the habits that once strengthened your faith begin to disappear. But because the change happens gradually, many believers do not recognize it right away. They simply feel different. Something inside them feels quieter than it once did. The passion they once felt during prayer feels weaker. The sense of excitement they once experienced when learning about God feels distant. And sometimes they begin to wonder why their spiritual life feels less alive. But the answer is often not complicated. It is simply that the connection has been neglected long enough for drift to occur. This is why spiritual disciplines are so important. Not because they are religious obligations, but because they anchor the soul. Just as a boat needs an anchor to remain steady in moving water, a believer needs consistent spiritual habits to remain grounded in faith. Prayer is an anchor. Scripture is an anchor. Reflection and worship are anchors. They keep the heart aligned with God, even when life becomes chaotic. Without those anchors, drift becomes almost inevitable. And the enemy understands this very well. He does not always need to convince someone to abandon their faith. He only needs to weaken the habits that keep that faith strong. Because once those habits disappear, the drift begins naturally. Another subtle sign of spiritual drift is when faith becomes more intellectual than personal. A person may still believe in God. They may still agree with spiritual truths. They may still identify as a believer. But the relationship begins to feel distant. Faith becomes something they think about rather than something they experience. Prayer becomes less like a conversation and more like a memory of something they used to do. And without realizing it, their spiritual life becomes more about knowledge than connection. But faith was never meant to be purely intellectual. Faith is relational. It grows through interaction, through conversation, through the quiet moments when someone opens their heart honestly before God. When those moments disappear, the relationship naturally becomes weaker. Another sign of spiritual drift appears in how someone responds to spiritual conviction. There was a time when certain thoughts or actions immediately created a sense of discomfort. A quiet inner voice would say, "This isn't the right direction," and that awareness helped guide choices. But when someone drifts spiritually, that sensitivity begins to fade. Conviction becomes quieter. The inner voice becomes harder to hear, not because God stopped speaking, but because the heart has become less attentive. Just like any other relationship, communication becomes harder when one side stops listening carefully. And the longer this drift continues, the more normal it begins to feel. Eventually, the person adapts to the distance. They stop expecting the closeness they once had. They stop seeking the connection that once felt natural. And their spiritual life becomes something that exists in the background rather than the center of their life. But here is the important truth many believers need to hear. Drift is not permanent. Distance from God does not mean the relationship is lost. In fact, the very awareness of drift is often the first step toward restoration. Because the moment someone recognizes that something has changed, they have the opportunity to respond. They can begin to rebuild the habits that once anchored their faith. They can begin returning to prayer, returning to reflection, returning to the quiet moments where connection with God becomes real again. And the beautiful thing about faith is that God does not require perfection to restore that relationship. He simply responds to sincere return. No matter how far the drift has gone, the path back begins with a single step, a single moment of honesty, a simple prayer. And when that happens, something remarkable often follows. The connection that once felt distant begins to return. The quiet voice that once felt difficult to hear becomes clearer again. And the faith that once felt weak slowly begins to grow stronger. Because drift may be quiet, but restoration can be powerful. And sometimes recognizing the first sign of spiritual drift becomes the very moment when a deeper, stronger faith begins to grow. One of the most powerful weapons used in quiet spiritual attacks is discouragement. Not the kind of discouragement that comes from obvious failure or visible loss, but the kind that appears without a clear explanation. You wake up one day and something feels different. Your energy feels lower. Your motivation feels weaker. Things that once gave you hope suddenly feel heavy. And when you try to explain it to yourself, nothing seems wrong. Your life might look stable. Your circumstances might be relatively normal. Yet inside, something feels off. You feel tired in a deeper way than simple physical exhaustion. You feel emotionally drained without knowing exactly why. And sometimes you begin to question things you once believed with confidence. Why does my faith feel weaker lately? Why do I feel so discouraged when nothing major has gone wrong? Many believers experience this season and assume something is wrong with them. They believe their faith is failing. They believe they have become spiritually weak. But often, what they are experiencing is something much more subtle. Discouragement is one of the enemy's most effective strategies because it attacks hope. Hope is the fuel of faith. When hope is strong, people keep moving forward. They continue praying. They continue trusting. They continue believing that God is working even when circumstances are difficult. But when hope weakens, something begins to change. Prayer becomes harder. Trust becomes fragile. Faith begins to feel uncertain. And the enemy understands that if he can weaken hope, he can weaken faith without needing to destroy it completely. That is why discouragement often appears in quiet, gradual ways. It begins with small thoughts. Thoughts that feel personal. Thoughts that seem logical. But thoughts that slowly reshape how a person sees their life. For example, someone may begin to think, "Nothing in my life is really changing. I've been praying for a long time and things still look the same. Maybe God is not listening." These thoughts rarely arrive all at once. They appear slowly. A small doubt here. A quiet frustration there. And if those thoughts remain unchallenged long enough, they begin to create emotional weight. Another strategy behind discouragement is magnifying problems. Every person faces challenges in life. Difficult situations, unexpected obstacles, moments where things do not go according to plan. But discouragement magnifies those problems until they appear larger than they truly are. A temporary setback begins to feel like a permanent failure. A small delay begins to feel like a closed future. An unanswered prayer begins to feel like divine silence. When problems are magnified this way, hope begins to shrink, because the mind starts focusing only on what is going wrong. But discouragement does something else as well. It minimizes hope. While problems grow larger in a person's mind, the possibilities for change begin to look smaller. Opportunities become invisible. Small blessings go unnoticed. Progress becomes harder to see. And eventually the person begins to believe that their situation will never improve. This is why discouragement can feel so heavy. It distorts perspective. It convinces people that the future will look exactly like the present, that nothing meaningful will change. But this belief is rarely based on truth. It is based on emotional exhaustion. Another reason discouragement becomes powerful is because it often isolates people. When someone feels discouraged, they often withdraw from others. They speak less about what they are feeling. They hide their struggles behind a calm appearance. And without realizing it, they begin to carry their emotional weight alone. Isolation strengthens discouragement because it removes the voices that might bring clarity and encouragement. Instead of hearing hope from others, the person hears only the thoughts inside their own mind. And those thoughts are often shaped by the discouragement they are already feeling. But here is an important truth many believers need to hear. Feeling discouraged does not mean your faith is weak. It means you are human. Even some of the strongest believers in history experienced seasons of discouragement. They experienced moments of exhaustion, moments of doubt, moments where the future felt uncertain. But those seasons did not define their story. Because discouragement is not the end of faith. It is often the moment where faith must become deeper. Faith that depends on visible results can easily collapse during difficult seasons. But faith that learns to trust God beyond circumstances becomes much stronger. And sometimes discouragement becomes the very environment where that deeper faith begins to grow. Another important truth is that discouragement often appears when someone is closer to a breakthrough than they realize. When progress feels slow, when prayers seem unanswered, when the journey feels long. Those are often the moments when people feel most tempted to give up. But giving up at that moment prevents them from seeing what might be just ahead. The enemy understands this pattern. If he can convince someone to quit before the outcome changes, he wins the battle without needing to fight any further. That is why discouragement often intensifies during seasons of waiting. Waiting tests patience. Waiting tests trust. Waiting forces a person to rely on faith rather than visible evidence. And during those seasons, discouraging thoughts become louder. You've waited long enough. Nothing is going to change. You should stop believing this will work out. But those thoughts are not always accurate reflections of reality. They are often emotional responses to uncertainty. The truth is that many of the most meaningful outcomes in life require time. Growth takes time. Transformation takes time. Preparation takes time. And during those quiet seasons of preparation, discouragement often tries to convince people that nothing is happening. But just because something is invisible does not mean it is inactive. Seeds grow underground long before they become visible above the surface. Foundations are built beneath the ground before a building rises into view. And in the same way, God often works in hidden ways before visible change appears. This is why understanding discouragement is so important. Because once you recognize how it works, you can begin to challenge its influence. You can begin to question the thoughts that appear during discouraging moments. You can remind yourself that feelings are not always accurate indicators of truth. You can choose to continue trusting even when emotions feel uncertain. And that choice slowly begins to weaken the power discouragement once had. Because discouragement thrives on silence and isolation. But it loses strength when someone begins to confront it with faith. Faith does not eliminate difficult emotions, but it changes how those emotions influence your decisions. Instead of allowing discouragement to define the future, faith allows hope to remain alive even during uncertainty. And sometimes that quiet decision to keep believing becomes the turning point in a person's spiritual journey. Because discouragement may be powerful, but it is not permanent. And the moment someone begins to recognize its influence, they also begin to rediscover the strength that was never truly lost. One of the most underestimated spiritual attacks is not temptation. It is not suffering. It is not even persecution. It is distraction. Because distraction rarely feels dangerous. It feels normal. It feels harmless. In fact, it often feels productive. You wake up in the morning with a list of responsibilities. There are tasks to complete, messages to answer, problems to solve. Your day quickly fills with activity. You move from one obligation to another, from work to errands, from conversations to deadlines. And by the time the day ends, you feel exhausted. But when you look back at the day, something feels strange. You were busy, very busy, but something meaningful feels missing. You spent hours doing things, yet your heart feels empty in a way you cannot easily explain. This is the quiet power of distraction. Distraction does not need to destroy your life. It only needs to consume your attention. Because attention is one of the most valuable resources you possess. Where your attention goes, your energy follows. Where your energy follows, your life begins to move. And if your attention becomes scattered across endless activities, your deeper purpose begins to fade into the background. The enemy understands something important about human nature. If he cannot destroy your faith, he will try to distract it. Because a distracted believer often becomes a spiritually weak believer. Not because they stop believing, but because they stop focusing. Think about how the modern world operates. Every day you are surrounded by noise. Phones vibrate. Notifications appear. Social media feeds update constantly. News cycles run 24 hours a day. Entertainment is available at every moment. Information floods your mind from every direction. At first glance, this environment does not appear spiritually dangerous. But over time, it reshapes how people think. It shortens attention spans. It trains the mind to constantly look for the next piece of stimulation. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness becomes rare. And yet, stillness is often where spiritual clarity begins. When Jesus spoke about the importance of retreating to quiet places, it was not accidental. Solitude creates space for reflection. It allows the heart to slow down. It creates the environment where someone can hear God more clearly. But in a world built on constant stimulation, those quiet spaces are disappearing. Many believers spend entire days moving from one distraction to another. They scroll through endless content. They jump between tasks. They absorb information without stopping to process what truly matters. And eventually, something begins to happen. Their spiritual focus becomes scattered. Prayer becomes harder because the mind has been trained to jump from thought to thought. Reflection becomes difficult because the mind expects constant stimulation. The ability to sit quietly with God begins to fade. This is why distraction can be such an effective spiritual attack. It does not need to convince someone to abandon their faith. It only needs to prevent them from paying attention to it. Another way distraction works is by filling life with activity that feels important but lacks deeper meaning. People become busy chasing achievements, career success, financial goals, social approval, recognition. None of these things are inherently wrong. But when they become the center of someone's attention, they slowly replace the deeper purpose that faith is meant to guide. The person begins to measure their worth by productivity, by status, by accomplishments. And without realizing it, they begin chasing goals that leave their soul unsatisfied. Because the human soul was never designed to find fulfillment through constant achievement. It was designed to find meaning through connection with God. When that connection becomes secondary, even the greatest accomplishments begin to feel empty. Many successful people eventually discover this truth. They reach goals they once believed would bring happiness. They achieve the recognition they once desired. But something still feels incomplete. The satisfaction they expected never fully arrives. And they begin to ask deeper questions. What am I really doing with my life? Why does success still feel empty? These questions often appear when distraction has kept someone busy for so long that they never stop to examine their deeper purpose. But distraction does not always appear through ambition. Sometimes it appears through endless minor activities. Small things that individually seem harmless, but collectively consume enormous amounts of time. Scrolling, watching content, responding to constant notifications, jumping between conversations and digital interactions. Hours pass quickly in this environment. Days blur together, and at the end of the week, it becomes difficult to remember what truly meaningful moments took place. Another danger of distraction is that it weakens spiritual awareness. When someone is constantly surrounded by noise, It becomes harder to notice the subtle ways God might be guiding their life. Guidance often comes through quiet impressions, moments of reflection, thoughtful decisions made in calm environments. But when the mind is always stimulated by external noise, those moments become rare, and the person begins to live reactively instead of intentionally. They respond to whatever appears in front of them, whatever message arrives, whatever demand appears next. Their life becomes controlled by outside influences rather than guided by deeper purpose. This is exactly what distraction aims to accomplish. It keeps people busy enough that they never stop to ask whether their direction is aligned with God's calling. But the moment someone begins to recognize this pattern, something powerful begins to change. They begin to question how they spend their attention. They begin to notice how often their mind is pulled toward things that do not truly matter. And they begin to realize that protecting their attention is part of protecting their faith. Because faith grows where attention is intentionally directed. Prayer requires attention. Reflection requires attention. Listening for God's guidance requires attention. And if attention is constantly consumed by distractions, those spiritual practices become weaker. But once someone becomes aware of this pattern, they can begin to reclaim their focus. They can begin creating moments of silence again. Moments where the mind slows down. Moments where the noise of the world fades long enough for deeper thoughts to emerge. And in those quiet spaces, something beautiful often happens. Clarity returns. Purpose becomes visible again. The connection with God that once felt distant begins to strengthen. Because distraction may be powerful, but intentional focus is even stronger. And when someone begins guarding their attention carefully, they begin reclaiming the spiritual direction that distraction once tried to steal. One of the most surprising things about this kind of spiritual attack is how invisible it can be. It does not arrive with warning signs. There is no dramatic moment where someone suddenly realizes, "I am under attack." Instead, it hides inside normal life. And that is exactly why so many believers never recognize it. When people think about spiritual battles, they usually imagine obvious conflict, clear moments of temptation, strong feelings of fear or doubt, situations where something clearly feels spiritually wrong. But distraction, drift, and discouragement rarely feel like spiritual warfare. They feel like ordinary life experiences. Feeling busy feels normal. Feeling tired feels normal. Feeling discouraged sometimes feels normal too. Because these emotions are common, most people never question where they come from. They simply accept them as part of life. But sometimes what feels normal is actually something much deeper. There are three main reasons why this spiritual attack often goes unnoticed. The first reason is that it happens slowly. Human beings are very good at noticing sudden change. If something dramatic happens in our lives, we immediately recognize it. If a relationship suddenly ends, we notice. If our health suddenly changes, we notice. If our circumstances dramatically shift, we notice. But slow change is much harder to recognize. Gradual shifts often happen beneath our awareness. Think about how seasons change during the year. When winter turns into spring, the transformation does not happen overnight. Each day looks almost the same as the day before. The temperature changes only slightly. The landscape changes little by little. But after several weeks, something remarkable has happened. The entire environment has transformed. Yet no single day felt dramatically different. Spiritual drift works the same way. The change happens slowly. One missed moment of prayer does not seem important. One distracted day does not feel like a problem. One week of spiritual neglect may seem understandable. But over time, those small moments accumulate. And eventually the spiritual environment of a person's life looks very different than it once did. The second reason many Christians fail to recognize this attack is because it hides inside good things. Many distractions are not evil. They are responsibilities. Work, family obligations, education, personal goals. These things are often necessary parts of life. But when they consume every moment of attention, they leave little space for spiritual connection. The problem is not that these activities exist. The problem is when they quietly replace the time and attention once given to God. Because when something good replaces something essential, the loss can be difficult to recognize. It feels responsible. It feels productive. It even feels mature. But deep inside, something begins to fade. The relationship with God becomes less central, less intentional, less alive. And because the person still believes in God, They assume everything is fine. They do not realize that belief alone does not sustain a relationship. Connection requires attention. The third reason this attack often goes unnoticed is because it disguises itself as emotional exhaustion. Many believers live in a state of constant fatigue. They feel mentally drained, emotionally tired, physically overwhelmed. When someone feels this way, spiritual practices often become the first things to disappear. Not because the person rejects them, but because they feel they do not have the energy. Prayer begins to feel difficult. Reflection feels impossible. And quiet time with God feels like another responsibility rather than a source of renewal. But here is something many people do not realize. Spiritual connection is not supposed to drain energy. It restores it. The very practices people abandon when they feel exhausted are often the practices that would strengthen them. Time in prayer can bring peace. Reflection can bring clarity. Spiritual connection can bring renewed hope. But when someone becomes trapped in a cycle of exhaustion and distraction, they may never experience those benefits. Instead, they remain stuck in a loop of constant activity and emotional fatigue. Another reason this attack goes unnoticed is because it does not immediately produce catastrophic results. When someone makes a clearly destructive decision, the consequences often appear quickly. But spiritual drift rarely produces immediate disaster. Life continues. Responsibilities continue. Outward success may even continue. This creates the illusion that everything is fine. But over time, something deeper begins to weaken. The inner strength that once sustained faith begins to fade. The sense of spiritual clarity becomes less certain. And when difficult moments eventually arrive, the person may find themselves feeling far less prepared than they once were. Because spiritual strength is not built in moments of crisis. It is built in the quiet, consistent habits that shape everyday life. When those habits disappear, the foundation becomes weaker even if the structure still looks stable on the outside. But there is another reason this spiritual attack often goes unnoticed. It quietly reshapes expectations. After enough time passes, people begin to accept the distance. They begin to believe that their current level of spiritual connection is normal. They stop expecting the closeness with God they once experienced. They stop seeking deeper understanding. They stop believing that something better is possible. And when expectations become lower, spiritual growth slows dramatically. But the truth is that God never intended faith to become distant or routine. Faith was meant to be alive, dynamic, personal. It was meant to guide decisions, shape character, and provide strength during uncertainty. When someone begins to rediscover that truth, something remarkable happens. They begin to realize that the quiet drift they experience does not need to define their future. They begin to see that the distractions, discouragement, and distance they felt were not permanent conditions. They were patterns that can be changed. And once someone recognizes these patterns, the attack begins to lose its power. Because spiritual awareness creates the opportunity for spiritual renewal. When you recognize the ways distraction has consumed your attention, you can begin reclaiming it. When you recognize the ways discouragement has influenced your thoughts, you can begin challenging it. When you recognize the quiet drift that has taken place, you can begin returning to the practices that once anchored your faith. And the beautiful truth about faith is that God responds quickly to sincere return. You do not need years to rebuild the connection. Often it begins with a single moment of honesty. A moment where someone simply says, "God, I realize I have drifted, and I want to come back." And in that moment, something powerful begins. Because awareness is the turning point. It is the moment when a quiet spiritual attack loses its invisibility. And once something becomes visible, it becomes possible to overcome. By now, you may be realizing something important. The spiritual attack most Christians don't recognize is not always dramatic. It doesn't always look like temptation. It doesn't always come through crisis. Sometimes it comes quietly, through distraction, through discouragement, through slow spiritual drift. And because it happens so gradually, many believers never realize it is happening at all. But the moment you become aware of it, something powerful begins to change. Because awareness breaks the illusion. When you recognize the pattern, you begin to see your life differently. You begin to notice where your attention has been going. You begin to notice how often your mind has been pulled in directions that leave your soul empty. You begin to see the small ways your spiritual connection has been neglected. And instead of feeling defeated by that realization, you can see it as something hopeful. Because recognizing the problem means you now have the power to change it. One of the most beautiful truths about faith is that distance from God is never permanent. God does not abandon people because they drifted. He does not reject people because they struggled. And He does not close the door simply because someone became distracted for a season. The invitation to return is always there. Always. In fact, many believers discover that the moment they sincerely return to God, they experience something surprising. They realize that God was never as distant as they felt. It was their attention that had moved away. And once that attention returns, the connection begins to feel alive again. This is why small decisions can create powerful change. You do not need to rebuild your entire spiritual life overnight. You simply need to begin again. Begin with one quiet moment of prayer, one honest conversation with God, one moment where you slow down long enough to remember what truly matters. That small step can begin shifting the direction of your life. Because direction is shaped by daily choices. Every day you choose where your attention will go. Every day you choose what will influence your thoughts. Every day you choose what voices you will listen to. And those choices slowly shape the condition of your soul. If your attention constantly moves toward noise, distraction, and endless activity, your spiritual life will slowly weaken. But if your attention intentionally returns to God, something different begins to happen. Your mind becomes clearer. Your heart becomes calmer. Your faith becomes stronger. Because spiritual strength does not grow through occasional inspiration. It grows through consistent connection. And connection grows through attention. When you protect the time you spend with God, you protect the foundation of your faith. You create space where wisdom can grow. You create moments where guidance becomes clearer. You create an environment where your spirit can rest instead of constantly reacting to the noise of the world. Another important truth to remember is that you are not alone in this struggle. Every believer faces seasons where distraction becomes stronger. Every believer faces moments where discouragement whispers lies. Every believer experiences times where faith feels weaker than it once did. But those seasons do not define the story of your life. They are simply part of the journey. And sometimes they become the very moments that lead to deeper faith. Because when someone recognizes how easily distraction can weaken their spiritual life, they begin to guard their attention more carefully. They begin to value silence. They begin to value prayer. They begin to value the quiet moments where their relationship with God becomes real again. And over time, those moments begin to reshape their life. The connection that once felt distant begins to grow stronger. The discouragement that once felt heavy begins to lose its power. And the purpose that once felt unclear begins to return. Because when attention returns to God, clarity often follows. Purpose often becomes visible again. And faith begins to feel alive in ways that may have been forgotten. So if you recognize yourself in this message today, do not feel discouraged. Do not feel ashamed. Instead, see it as an invitation. An invitation to wake up spiritually. An invitation to reclaim your attention. An invitation to rebuild the connection that matters more than anything else in your life. Because the greatest victory in spiritual warfare is not dramatic. It is quiet. It happens when someone decides to return. When someone chooses to protect their faith again. When someone refuses to allow distraction to steal what matters most. And that decision can begin right now. With one moment. One prayer. One simple step back toward the God who has been waiting patiently for your attention all along.